Welcome, everyone, to this conversation today, talking about data visualization inspiration and taking inspiration from spaces that look beyond just our immediate data visualization family. I'm really excited today to be joined by Dr. Brandeis Marshall, who is joining us from Atlanta. You're joining us from Atlanta?
Yes, I am.
Welcome, Dr. Marshall. How are you today?
I am doing great. How are you?
I'm good, busy. End of the year and everything else that comes with it.
Exactly.
Um, so I'm really excited to have Dr. Marshall here today. She's a professor who teaches, speaks, and writes about the impact of data practices on technology and society. Her work contributes to the data engineering, data science, and data and computer science education fields. And through her DataedX group organization, she guides current tech workers in building data equity skills. In her first book, congratulations,
Thank
Data,
you.
Data Conscience, Algorithmic Siege on Our Humanity was released in September 2022. There it is. I love it. The book unearths the interlocking computational and civic implications of data on digital processes, structures, and institutions. So welcome to joining us today, Dr. Marshall.
Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be a good conversation.
I hope so. I think it'll hopefully spark some interesting thinking across our data visualization community. And if you missed the title of our talk today, we're going to be talking about why you shouldn't move fast and break things anymore. And I'm excited to cede the stage over to Dr. Marshall to pull up her slides and to go ahead and get us started and talk to us about what it means to not move fast and break things anymore. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Marshall.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Well, thanks for coming into this conversation because this is an uncomfortable conversation to talk about data and how data sometimes doesn't perform the way we want, and sometimes data can be manipulated in ways that we don't like, but yet sometimes can't anticipate. So thanks for having me. Thanks for coming in again to this room and listening a little bit to maybe some thoughts that you've had in the nature of your work and how you might want to think through how you now move in the visualization community and think through ethics and responsible transmission and dissemination of data. So I'm going to start with, I think, where people probably don't expect me to start, which is the best case scenario of move fast and break things. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the term, it is a mantra that has been spoken about for at least 10 years. And the whole notion behind move fast and break things is in order for tech to innovate quickly, to be able to fail fast, and understanding those failures in order to get to the innovation that's actually going to work. In that process, there has been a lot of friction and strife about the usefulness of this mantra and how now that everything is pretty much digitized, whether or not move fast and break things is actually a good approach. And of course, I don't think it is anymore. But I'm going to start with the best case scenario. So, where move fast and break things actually work. In this example, what I'm showing here on the slide is essentially the remastering of Princess Leia from, of course, the movies um, of Star Wars. So the actor that played Princess Leia wind up passing away, but there were scenes in which her character needed to be part of the film, but she was unable in order to execute those lines. So what has happened is that the film industry was able to take the images of previous footage and then reconstruct them in a way in order to make it seem as though she was saying new lines, as well as being part of the film, the new films moving forward. So this has been a good thing, right? The best case, right? You're able to essentially finish out a project even though the original individual was not there. Great. You're able to go ahead and use the work that's already there, and you didn't actually break anything. You just remastered or reconstructed it, repurposed it. Fabulous. But that is my only best case scenario. Okay. So when we move fast and break things, what we have seen over the past Ooh, let's say the past 5 years on a regular basis, like every single month of the past 5 years, we've seen very bad scenarios. So the first one that I'm going to talk through happens to be gender shades. If you're not familiar with gender shades, it's gendershades.org. You can see how AI has taken the faces of people and used that facial recognition to identify and, of course, misidentify people. That misidentification has been across gender as well as race lines. And depending upon the product, there's 3 products that were using this work. You will see there is definitely a typical bias, an algorithmic bias associated with people who are darker complected, people who happen to be non male identifying. That's not the only one. This was work done in about 2018. But even before 2018, there was, of course, recidivism algorithm back in 2016. So this was work and expose done called Machine Bias that looked through the criminal justice system. If you have not heard about it, you can of course see the work. You can go ahead and use the interwebs and see all the details. But this is just one of the figures as part of that particular investigative report that showed recidivism when it comes to Black defendants tended to be of they tended to have higher scores or be of higher risk to, of course, commit more crimes, even though their white defendants of the same crime level tended to have lower scores of recidivism. This is very stark. We can talk through a lot when it comes to the criminal justice system. In fact, as part of my book in the very first chapter, I talk through how did the criminal justice system even start and begin. And of course, it didn't start in the United States, it started over in France, and some of those learnings came over to the United States and then criminalized people with certain attributes, certain physical characteristics. And then it started to criminalize people with certain melanin complexions. But again, that's in my book. I'm just going to continue on with worst case scenario of moving fast, not considering the demographics of who is being impacted by these technologies. And then one of the most famous notions of move fast and break things happens to be when it comes to deep fakes. And if you're unfamiliar with deep fakes, here's a little bit of an example. No, on one side is Jordan Peele. He is, of course, a producer, a filmmaker, and an actor. And he does very good impressions. One of the impressions that he does very well happens to be of President Barack Obama. And so he did a split screen of his face actually saying words and those words being shown coming out of President Obama's mouth. You can see the video. It's only about 2 minutes. It actually was a public service announcement. And you can actually see how he did it. You can see the words coming out of Jordan Peele's mouth, but President Obama is saying it in a President Obama voice. And it's all in order to explain how it's very possible for 2 people who have similar complexions, similar face structures, and one person can take the voice of another person, use algorithms in order to now impersonate the person online. And believe me, President Obama wasn't the only person this happened to. And this is a very clean version of how deepfakes are used. Again, I talk about this in much more in depth in the book, but let me tell you, deepfake technology is pretty scary on just how much video of us is out there, how our voices could be manipulated, and we could be saying things that we would never ever say. But digitally, it is the truth. So we've moved fast and we've broken down our humanity in a way that's very shocking, very alarming, and could induce even more harm. Right. So what this all comes to is that algorithms are much more than math. This is not just an equation that happens to be manipulated. This happens to be whole lives that are impacted. People are given more time incarcerated because of recidivism algorithms. People are misclassified on videotapes because the algorithms have said that their physical characteristics were a match, even though that individual may not have been in that location. So again, criminalizing people with melanated skin. Third, there is possibilities that you and your likeness could be somewhere on the interwebs, right? Without your knowledge, saying or doing things that you would not have done. And this is giving rise to misinformation campaigns and disinformation campaigns. Essentially, lies that are spewed out, and there's no way to retract this. So, algorithms are much more than just the math. In addition, data is much more than the numbers, right? So everything that I've been talking about thus far has been and has its roots in data. I mean, to me, data fuels the algorithms that's actually building the tech. So if you get the data right, which of course we can talk ad nauseum about what is right about data and what's wrong about data. But if you understand and contextualize the data, then you would be able to understand the context, the political, the social, the economic, the civic ramifications of what is happening as far as the algorithms and, of course, their product, the tech. So that means that we have to actually lead with context with everything that we're doing. No matter if we are just taking some audio, doesn't mean if we're taking some data from some analysis and trying to visualize it, doesn't mean if we're now trying to do our best in order to bring together both images and audio in order to explain the story. We have to lead with a certain context. And so I've done this for y'all with a data visualization slant. So first up, I have to talk about the interwebs, because the interwebs, it is crazy on how much data is out there and how much is happening per minute. And this is from 2021. I didn't get the 2022 information because it's even more startling. But in 2021, we have all different types of platforms that host content. So I'm just going to take a couple of them, some of like my favorites and ones that I use quite a bit. So email, there is nearly 200 million emails sent in a minute. Yes, y'all, in a minute. 500 hours of content is uploaded to YouTube. And for everybody that's on the TikTok, I'm not on the TikTok, but on the TikTok, 5,000 downloads is happening. I watch TikTok on like Instagram, but Instagram itself has its own heavy content usage. I mean, nearly 700,000 stories are shared in 1 minute. This is a lot of data, which means there are a lot of algorithms that are trying to churn this data and then provide it to you in a way that is manageable, that's a way that's digestible. And it is very, very difficult. Right. So what do you do inside of the data viz community? Right. And I'm just going to like run this little GIF for a minute here, because it's important to understand that in order to have all of this content managed, you have to automatically find ways in order to present it so that people not in your area can understand what is going on, because not everyone is a data viz expert, not everyone is a data viz enthusiast or professional or practitioner. So what do you tell them to do? There's a certain amount of processes that you have to implore, right? So in the beginning, we get all the data and it's very raw. There's a lot of content. It's sometimes very, very, very messy, lots of holes. But in the beginning, what winds up happening is that Of course, you want to start stripping away some of the mess and the muss and the fuss. You want to be removing information, removing some of these details to make it cleaner and easier to understand. But I raise questions about whether or not we are removing too much. There is information loss that is happening, and we need to think through what we actually want to highlight. And y'all do this all the time when you're creating these figures and graphs and dashboards, right? So, yes, less is more, but it does not necessarily mean that less is better. So, I just want to bring this up as a conversation point for all of us to have. And before I like wrap up my like these just thoughts in order to consider is think through what is the stage of the data pipeline that you're in. So here's a figure that I found online, and of course I want to make sure to reference the original um, presenters and creators of this particular figure, which is Gaping Void. They put together this like 6 part um, dissemination and digestion of how we move through data. And I think this is very apropos of how we think about data. Data starts out very general and unconnected. It gets transformed into information that then is labeled, right, on the plane. Next up is knowledge. And with knowledge, we are forming connections. So we're connecting the different sets of information. So we're starting to build context, right, in more meaningful ways. The fourth step happens to be insight. And an insight is when you start to understand where is the popular points, where is the information that is most valuable to the audience that you want to present the data to. The fifth step actually moves from insight to wisdom, which is how are you getting from one point of insight to another point of insight? How are you forming those connections? How are they related to all the other content that is involved in your data space, right? And then lastly, there is the impact. That is the 6 steps, is how are you then reorganizing all of the wisdom to be in a way that you are now zeroing in on your message. That's the message that's on the dashboard. That's part of the figure. That's part of the chart. That is, of course, part of that dashboard. And this is a wonderful representation of what happens with anyone that works inside the data space. The challenge that we have with this is that not all data can be labeled. So from data to information, that first step to that second step, it does not mean that every single set of information can become information. That data can just be data that needs to be thrown away. That's just noise, that's just junk. But we always try to take every piece of data and make it information. And I think this is where we need to have some critical conversations. And I think as part of the data viz community, y'all know this probably the best because you are trying to take data that is in some form and trying to see whether or not to present it. You're making these decisions. So let's have these conversations. So before we go, right, before you hear like the Q&A, before we like wrap up this particular set of thought-provoking conversation, just understand some of these main points. Move fast and break things doesn't work for all people, especially people who are highly excluded, right? People who are not part of the dominant group, people who have accessibility and disabilities. So let's start thinking through maybe we need to stop from moving fast and breaking things. I suggest we move slower and build better. And how we do that is by prioritizing context when it comes to data, learning and understanding, and of course, presentation and representation, right? And so the last thing I will say is I'm going to leave you with this thought of how do we intentionally usher in transparency, accountability, and governance when it comes to building out your data viz products and tools. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully this is a kickstarting a conversation, and can't wait to engage more.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall. It's great to hear from you and to get some of your perspectives on how our choices and design decisions, especially around simplifying things or oversimplifying things, can sometimes have negative consequences, which I think is something that we've talked about a lot in our community. So we'll go ahead and we'll connect in on this wonderful chat with the conversation that happened with the IIB Day of Inspiration event. For those of you who are just joining us for this chat for the first time, I just want to remind you that if you are interested in diving into the world of the Information is Beautiful Awards a bit deeper and exploring some of the more complex visualizations that are out there that do try to bring in some context and nuance, you can find all of that at informationisbeautifullawards.com. And those awards are hosted by, and today's chat is hosted by, the Data Visualization Society. And we'd love to continue these kind of conversations, both through the Q&A with Dr. Marshall, but also over on our Slack channel and in other community spaces, because these aren't things that are going to go away for us as practitioners over the course of the next, couple weeks or months. I think this will be an ongoing conversation in our field and our community for years to come as we grapple with some of the ways in which our simplified design decisions sometimes have those negative consequences. So with that, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up today with the formal part of our presentation and dive into the Q&A. Dr. Marshall, any kind of closing thoughts for those who are just joining us for the first time today?
You were part of the grassroots effort in order to bring more equity into the data viz community. So I welcome you to join and lock arms with each other, and let's get to work. Let's make it better for more people, for further generations, for the past generations. Let's do the thing. So appreciate you just being part of the conversation and being open to hearing a different perspective.
Fantastic. Well, we'll go ahead and we'll knit in our Q&A session from our live session a few days ago. With that, we'll go ahead and sign off the formal recording. I'm Amanda McCulloch. I'm the Executive Director for the Data Visualization Society, and joined today by Dr. Brandeis Marshall. And we'll look forward to having these conversations continue for a long time to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question we have from Jessica is, how can we help to improve all of the tools? So she said, for example, in the case of Google Images, if there is some bias in how things are represented in some context, how can we as users actually improve the algorithm? And is that possible? I guess is a question I would have.
Right. So as an individual user, it's very difficult because there's so many people that are using these publicly facing tools. So one of the things is really to call it out. Right. So every time you see an issue with the way that a tool is working, is to document it, to call it out. Most people of years past would use Twitter. Other people would use internal type of reporting systems. But there is legislation that's starting to get a little traction in order to help companies be more reflective and responsible. So if you are currently building a tool to be used, my answer would be conversation with the team building the tool. From the very beginning, have an ethics team, have an ethics process, right? Like you would go through a code review, do the same things when it comes to an ethics review. Start from the beginning in order to see, does this actually make sense? Who is going to be harmed? How would that harm manifest? And is this a project that we actually want to move forward? Before you write a line of code, creating a tool, trying to fix a problem that maybe not a problem. Because all my cause for pause examples that I gave, none of them really are a problem. I mean, it's cool, but cool doesn't necessitate creating a tool.
Well, and you say like do this kind of review or look at this kind of framework. For someone who's starting out brand new, is there a resource or a guide or anything else besides maybe reading through your book and looking at some of what you share there that you would refer folks to for that kind of checklist of things to think about? I know a couple of things pop out of my head, but I'm wondering what your go-to resources are.
Well, I love making sure that I'm connected to newsletters because the field changes quite a bit. So if you're new, I would say there is an ethics and data science book. I believe that was created probably about 7 years ago or so that does provide a great framing. That was by DJ Patel and some other folks. So that's a good start point. I think if you want to think through like staying current in the environment of data ethics, there is AI Ethics Weekly, which is a newsletter, which I think is really good. It provides a nice kind of snapshot of what's happening. I have my own newsletter, Rebel Tech newsletter that I do every other week. And then the other checklists are sort of pros and cons, but another really good resource where I kind of guide people to, if they just want like an overview, is fast.ai, has a nice free ethics course that goes through misinformation, it goes through algorithmic bias, it just sort of gets you into understanding what is happening in the field. And it's just, 6 or 7 different lessons and very helpful.
Very cool. We'll have to pull those resource links and start to add those into the chat below. Maybe my colleague Alex, who's hanging out behind the scenes, can pull a couple of those for us. My fingers aren't fast enough to Google all of them right away. I think a great question we have from the room right now, Leslie is helping to moderate in the room, is no tool is going to be perfect.
Yeah.
But how can we be more transparent about the limitations of the tools that we're using?
Oh yeah, this is, I think, a spot on assessment. And this is one of the things that stop people. Like, the tool's not going to be perfect, so why should we even try? Documentation. We need to document what's happening. We need to ask questions throughout the building of these tools and the usage of these tools, right? Many people are like, oh, well, we just have a case study. It's anecdotal that there is some issues inside of these tools. No, let's start to document them. I mean, I tried to search and find, give me issues with tool X. And you can go on the interwebs and try any tool and you will not get a list. So, but I think that as a community, if you are using a particular tool and you see that there are limitations, start to document them and do that as a collective, and then share those out. And then what are some of the remedies? So think of it as like a software patch. You're fine with going ahead and updating your software every few months, because you need to, you have no choice. But I think it's important in order to make sure that you do document, and also to make sure that you do note when there are issues inside of the tool. So that's how you can be more transparent, especially if you're a data practitioner. Right.
It's interesting because I think we talk a lot about in data visualization, data viz style guides or branding guides that we check to make sure, like, did we use the right fonts? Did we use the right colors when we're producing something? And it's an interesting question of also kind of how are you adding data quality checks or data ethics checks into those kind of other checklists, that it just becomes part of our practice, rather than being something we think about later. Similar to accessibility, as we talk about accessibility and how do we plan for that from the start instead of focusing on building that in later.
Yeah.
Annabelle had a follow-on kind of to the question about resources. Do you have, or have you planned on making some online data ethics guidelines that would be open for folks to have as a checklist that kind of accompanies your book and your work?
Yes. Short answer,
it doesn't exist yet, but
it doesn't exist yet. Yeah, so as part of my book, I list a number of questions. I think I have like 11 or 12 questions that I list throughout the book, and I'm looking at expanding those to say, okay, this is where I started. This is where I would like people to go with this, with these questions. So I have 3 groups of questions. The first set of questions is why, like why questions, which is very confrontational. I know if you have any type of psychology background, why questions are very much put people on the defense, but I say why questions need to come first. And then there are what questions, and then there are how questions. So the reason why I go through this process is because a lot of times when we're building tools and when we're creating any type of content, we always go to how. To your point, Amanda, which font is good? That's how, but it doesn't deal with why, right? Why is that particular font a good font, right, to you? So the same type of questions I want to lead for data ethics. Let's do the why first, then what we are doing, because sometimes you know why, but what you're doing sometimes doesn't match with solving the why, and then getting to the how, which is the execution. That's where all the tech people want to stay, is in the how, but we need to back it up, right? And talk about the why, then the what. But yes, that is a plan for 2023, probably end of 2023, because it's going to take some time to think through some of these things. And I know it's a very long-winded answer, and there's a lot of legislation that is happening. And so I want to make sure that as I'm thinking through some points to consider when doing data ethics, that I am marrying it with some of the legislation that's coming down the pike that's been presented, and also being aware of a lot of the work that's being done in the EU already when it comes to some type of data ethics checks and things like that.
I love that. And I know if folks are looking, if they can't wait until 2023, they can certainly read your book. Also, they can go ahead and I think one of the places I often send people if they're just digging into this space is the We All Count website. And the data equity framework is one place that folks can look if you're just starting out and trying to think about like what's even the outline of things to think about. And that's one place that folks can go if they're looking for kind of an idea on things to ask questions about. And it's not data ethics focused entirely, but asking questions about funding, motivation, project design, data collection. And it's not unique just to data visualization.
Right.
So I've sent folks here before when they're saying, I don't even know what questions to start to ask.
Yeah.
Working on these kind of things. So
that's a great site. And also AI Blind Spot. That's another one as well. If you can go on the interwebs and bring that one up, that's a really good one as well. But this is giving me good ideas in order to just write some of these things down, because they, of course, both of these are on my phone all the time. But AI Blind Spot.
AI Blind Spot, this one?
Yeah. So they actually create cards, which is all about, how are you dealing with design, and also through execution and deployment of your tool, what do you need to think through? And so this is sort of the what are the questions to ask? This particular resource, I think, has some really powerful questions and powerful considerations, very insightful considerations. It's of course very sequential, which is good and bad. But I believe if someone is new, this would provide them with, these are some of the things I need to think through as I'm designing or implementing a particular tool.
Well, it's definitely sequential, but I give them credit that it looks like it's a feedback loop. It never stops, right?
Yes.
And so when you get back to the beginning again, you can go ahead and start reassessing, and reminds me of some of the design thinking frameworks that we see.
Yes, and that's where a lot of the root of what they based their work on was design thinking and understanding how is the process of design and then how do we interject and intervene in the design process in order to bring up conversations that remove some of the blind spots.
So another question that's kind of data visualization specific from the room, how do you see the role of data visualization, so our practice in our field, in this algorithmic transparency? And do you have any examples you can share maybe of where people have done a good job of being explicit there, things that we should look at as models?
Oh, that's a great question. I think when it comes to data visualization, y'all got put on Front Street for the pandemic. And it was like y'all were thrust into everyone caring about data visualization. So I did see a lot of opaqueness during that time. So I think when it comes to algorithmic transparency, I think it's about the decisions that are made informing the dashboards at the time, and the continued conversation about how are you forming dashboards, what data sets are you using, how have those data sets been cleaned before. So that I think is very, very important. As far as good models that I've seen, good model is relative. Let's put it that way. I think that there are situations where I've seen some really good landscape views of things. When it came to COVID, I believe that at some points, the Johns Hopkins dashboard did a very good job in the beginning, but then it stopped. And then it turned into, then there was another dashboard that tended to do better. So I think when it comes to good models, I think we need to think about the timing of when those models are good, because sometimes the models just lose their effectiveness, if that makes sense. But as
Mhm.
far as a model that has just been great all the way around, I can't share an example. And I know that's what y'all want. Like it's this question I get all the time. What is a good model for um, data engineering, data analytics, data visualization, data storytelling? It depends on who's sharing it and when it's being shared to know if it's actually a good example.
It's interesting because I think one of the challenges we had a lot in COVID, especially, but just have broadly, is around how do you encode and visualize uncertainty? And it's a
Yeah.
space that, like, displaying that uncertainty visually in different ways, making things looking sketchier so they don't look quite as finite, and finding ways to communicate where data is uncertain or might have quality gaps is something that we're still working through as a field. And there's really interesting research happening that I think I just keep kind of churning and looking for when the next paper comes out on those kind of topics, because I think there's a lot of those sticky areas that there's how can we be more transparent overall in how we write about and communicate about our work, but also how do we visually encode things that are less certain when people kind of see visualizations, this bar is longer than that bar, as being somewhat finite and believable.
Right. And also it's about educating the public and understanding that, as I said, data is not numbers, that there is this variable of uncertainty that is inherent in all things that have a data underpinning. And that's part of, I think, the education that needs to happen for everyone in the data industry, is just to understand that people want things to be 100% certain, but when it comes to data visualization, it's not 100% certain.
So I think that we're getting kind of close to our end on time, and I want to also kind of think about the fact that we'll be pivoting over to talk about data careers next with a panel of folks here in the room talking about many different data careers, and that's a space that you work in a lot in terms of helping to enable people to pursue different data careers and data spaces, and talking about the role that having, whether you call it data literacy, data fluency, those kind of ways of speaking data as a member of the public being really important. So as we kind of close out and we kind of close out our conversation today, any thoughts on the kind of future of the data career space and what that looks like, and how you see data visualization skills fitting into the different career paths that are out there?
I will say first that, data skills are life skills. So it doesn't matter if you are in data viz or not, you're going to need to understand how data operates, because you are data. Data is you. And so when it comes to a career path, there's a lot of opportunity. I was just having a conversation yesterday with somebody who was in the healthcare realm, and she didn't realize that she was a data person. And having this conversation with her, she was like, "Oh, really? I could do that. Yes, I do create reports. Yes, I do care about the clinical side of how health data is presented and reported and things like that." So I think when it comes to data careers in visualization, there's even more opportunity in order to have conversations of how someone can take their domain expertise that's outside of data viz and marry that with data visualization skills. If that is creating dashboards, if that is storytelling and narrating, what is that communication style, right? It's not just about the fonts and the colors. It's also about what is that content being shared. So I think there's going to be even more conversation about how do you create lanes in this conversation about data careers, right? I think it's super important. I think there is a great conversation. If you were not on the Bird app, you can definitely check me out or Amanda's out, and you will see that we were in this great Twitter thread about just about data visualization and about this notion of professionalizing, right? What is the pros and cons of professionalizing data visualization? I think there's a conversation to be had about putting together collective efforts in organizing the discipline in a way that people who are new to it can come in with data ethics first in mind, and also with some standard understanding of practices, not made by a few people, but made by the collective of the industry, so that their career can be longstanding and it can be accessible to people from outside the discipline. Because I'm outside the discipline. But I'm constantly sharing visualizations in some way. I'm sharing visual content at the very least, in 99% of my talks. Not this one, but in 99% of my talks. So I think that that is an important conversation to be had. I think educators need to have a path within data visualization that tell them how to present content much better, because you're not taught that in graduate school. I think there needs to be a conversation to business leaders and decision makers and organizations of data visualization skills and what is that particular skill set, so they can ask poignant questions when they see visualizations, because that's a big problem, right? 80% of business leaders don't really understand the visuals being presented to them, that they're making decisions. So there, as I said, there's a lot of opportunity, but there needs to be, I think, some type of boundaries and guardrails in order to help folks understand what those career paths are, what is important for them to understand given their particular domain background.
Thank you for that. Well, and I agree that, I mean, what's something we're working on within DVS and hope to continue to support is how do you bring together those kind of learning paths to make it not to create a gatekeeping effect on the field, but rather to create a more inclusive path to saying, here are the things you can learn and the fundamentals you can practice.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really good note to end on, and probably pivots us well to our next talk. If you have been inspired by Dr. Marshall's conversation today, it would be great to see folks check out her book. It has a lot more of those different ideas and components in them. I think it's really important as we think as an organization, DVS, and as an industry, about the ways in which we connect with folks who are in these adjacent spaces, because there's so much that we can learn from that we don't need to reinvent the wheel on things like data ethics or other related kind of issues of bias and challenges that we face as data practitioners. So with that, Dr. Marshall, we'll go ahead and say farewell. Thank you so much for your time today and for being an absolute champ at running without slides. I'm very curious about the visuals that you and I were chatting about, the things you're going to pull up, and I think that those Twitter threads were on there. So I'm a little bit disappointed that we missed out on those. But
I wind up not doing.
We'll share them with our DVS community for people to go ahead and click through. And I think it was a great conversation today for folks who were able to join us for this live chat. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for hanging with me with no slides.
Of course.
Bye.